All right, we might get started. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the final session in the Heart and Soul with Dr. Timothy D. Kanold webinar series. In the spirit of reconciliation, Hawker Brownler Education acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Finally, for the last time in this very special series, I will pass you over to Dr. Timothy Kanold, award-winning educator, author, and consultant. He's got lots of credits to his name. I think we might zoom through them very quickly. He's committed to equity and excellence for students, faculty, and school administrators, a substantial part of that being the effective delivery of the PLC process by faculty and administrators. He's a former director of mathematics and science and served as principal of Adelaide East Stevenson High School District 125, a model professional learning community district in Lincolnshire, Illinois. He's a past president of the National Council of Supervisors of Mathematics and is a prolific author as co-author of several best-selling mathematics textbooks over several decades and author or co-author of 13 books on K-12 mathematics and school leadership since 2011, including the best-selling book Heart, which is available for you to order right now, and the upcoming book Soul, which is also available for pre-order. And with that, I will pass you over to Tim.
All right, thanks, Lauren, appreciate it. And my thanks to you for coming on today. I know there's a lot going on as your school year is ending, and I appreciate you taking the time for an hour together with me this morning. This session is going to be really interesting to me. I think it's going to provide a couple of really nice ideas for you to think about how you might share these with your colleagues at the end of the year. Also, some things for reflection, perhaps with your colleagues during the summer or even on your own. We're actually going to look at the professional learning community aspect of our collaborative work and how do we actually create a culture in which we're thriving in community together. And these things come out of sort of the middle and end part of Soul and the things I've written about in the book. But I really want us to take a look at three specific areas. How do we understand and develop a culture of belonging in our schools? How do we create a culture of vulnerability? And what does validation really look like? What does it mean and why is it so important? We're going to unpack those three things in a pretty robust way. And then I would, hopefully if I get a minute at the end, we'll have a little bit of time for a Q&A, which would be nice if we could do it. All right. So when I initially wrote Heart, I was really writing it out of my experiences as a prior school principal and superintendent and teacher at the place where we actually birthed the entire PLC process. My school district in the middle of the United States in suburban Chicago, Illinois, was the place where Rick DeFore, who was one of the original architects for the work, was our principal before I was. And I worked with him in math and science. So we worked together to try to say, okay, what does this learning community thing look like? And how can we pursue a story where we get every faculty member to begin to work and every administrator to work towards the moral good that we have as a responsibility as stewards of the students in our school. And one of the things we recognize is that we are a profession of emotional labor. Our jobs are highly relational, very emotional. And this comes whether it's working with our students or working with our colleagues. And just as I designed in Heart that our heart measures our impact on others, I believe our soul story, our journey, over time, as our seasons unfold, measures our impact on the good that we're doing in our schools. And I think this year, above all years, I've never seen anything like it in terms of testing that and testing our ability to come to work in a positive emotional state on a daily basis. But one of the things we recognized at Stevenson in the place where we birthed this professional learning community culture process was that our jobs are a lot easier if we can thrive in community with one another. The professional learning community motto became this idea: many of us will come together and unite into one And by one, we mean one what? Well, one guaranteed and viable curriculum, one understanding of the essential elements of great instruction, one understanding in terms of the way in which we're going to know if students are learning or not. And so we began to answer these critical questions together in order to erase inequities in student learning. And we found out it's not easy. Community, when you break down the word, com or com, C-O-M-M, basically means with, together, or jointly. So we're going to work jointly together with one another. Unity means a totality of related parts. In other words, we all have input. We all have a shared understanding of what great learning looks like. So we become stronger because we work together. And to do that, we've said one of the moral goods that we can do in our school community is to not work in isolation. That would be considered bad practice, malpractice, amoral. That the moral good of our school district or our school is served by working interdependently with one another on an ongoing basis, week in, week out. And as I mentioned, in order to erase inequities in our practice so that students are learning with the same levels of rigor. I'm not testing at this level of rigor and you're testing here. So that made me think that this reminds me a lot of being married. You know, like I don't get to just make my own decisions about what we're going to do next, what we're going to do next week, the way we're going to walk through all aspects of our life have to be made in community with my spouse, in this case, my wife. I wanted to show you this because for anybody that's on the call from the Sydney area, this is the Beachside Dash. This is actually the one coming up in November 2020. And because it's virtual, I'm actually going to participate. I actually ran in it 2 years ago. In fact, here's my actual bib from 2 years ago, because we happened to be in the Sydney area in September of 2 years ago and saw the race. And both my wife and I, in fact, here we are. We actually were the only Americans in the race, and every Australian that was there treated us with such great kindness. You can see we're even wearing our St. George Hospital hats, the green hats. And I happened to be running in the race in a green shirt. And my wife had green sunglasses. So we're like, okay, we definitely fit in with all of the green dragons or dinosaurs that were running around as well. But it's for a good cause, right? It's for this cause of the research of that center. But what I noticed in that day in watching all of the Australians that were at this race and participating in it with us and their wonderful response to us was that close relationships, more than money or fame, are what keep people happy throughout their lives, the study revealed. Those ties, your close relationship, protect us from life's discontents, all the stuff that beats down on us. What has carried you this year in a pandemic year has been the close relationships, even if you've had to keep them at a distance. And this comes from an 80-year-old study from Harvard University, as they have watched several generations. And they went on to say it delays mental and physical decline, and are better predictors of long and happy lives than the social class you belong to, your IQ, or even the quality of your genes. And so if we want a predictor of a happy workplace, of a life, a professional life, one of the ways to get there is to make sure we're developing and thriving in community with one another, that our professional family is indeed a family with all of the warts and stuff that it comes with. So it's this idea of building your life in a way that has depth to it. Because when we operate in isolation, we can kind of get away with being shallow because no one else is noticing. When we operate in depth, then when we're getting to that place of shallowness, someone says, oh no, come back here. So I want to ask you to do something with your colleagues who are not on this webinar with us today. I want you to go back, and before the school year ends, you've got about a month, right? To write one sentence, to ask your colleagues, in a final meeting, whatever, and when I say colleagues, I mean whatever that is for you, whatever your job is, however that looks. to write one sentence, put it on a note card, turn it in, to describe current evidence you are part of a professional community of related parts, right? Let's go back there. A totality of related parts. Community means we don't just come together and sort of have a nice time and I'll share and you share, but it doesn't really impact me. No, it means we're going to share and we're going to work on solutions together. My solution will be related to your solution and we will both honor those agreements. So if you were going to write one sentence, what would that be? And ask everybody to write that down on one side of the note card. On the other side of the note card, I would ask you to do this. And for our purposes today, I'm going to stop for a minute and ask you to actually type in an answer. Use the chat box to share a brief example of where you have thrived at work in 2020 because of another colleague. You were able to thrive because of a colleague that you work with. Can you give a brief example of that? So 3 weeks from now, when you're getting towards the end of your final meeting, you're going to ask these two questions, one side of the postcard, note card, the other side of the note card. But here today, I'd like you to just answer, to use the chat box. I'll get quiet for a couple of minutes, 2 minutes. And I'd like you to just type in the chat box a brief example, something where you have thrived at work in this very difficult year because of another colleague. Okay? All right, so take a minute. If you don't want to share, I understand, then just write it down. But if you're willing to publicly share so other people can see and maybe learn from that, that would be great. All right, thanks. And I'll do the same. I'm gonna type in one myself. All right, good luck. Oh, I'll time it. These are great. Thank you. All right, thanks everybody. So, I'm not going to be around. I'm not allowed to fly to Australia right now, but if I could come into your school, I would really encourage you to ask these two questions. Number one, if you publish the results, you're going to be surprised at how that other colleague doesn't even know you had that impact on them. And this is part of joy that I talked about last time in the workplace is being aware of others and thanking them for what they're doing. But also that idea of evidence that you're part of a professional community of related parts is just as important, whether that evidence is with respect to instruction or assessment or interventions or even your curriculum design. All of those things we do as professionals, as educators. All right, so good luck with this one, and thank you for putting yourself out there. 2 years ago when I was doing the beachside dash, that came because my wife and I spent some time in Sydney after I spoke at a conference at our international PLC conference. That year it was in Brisbane, and one of the things that we talked about there was something that came from one of my colleagues, Anthony Mohammed. And I know some of you know Anthony. He's done quite a bit of work in Australia. And he was a keynoter at that conference. And as I was listening to Anthony, he talked about this idea that education of our children, the education of our children is not, it's not a contest. They're not supposed to be winners and losers. It's not like a soccer match. It's not like the Olympics. It's literally every child should win. If we say it's the guaranteed and viable curriculum, we really mean it. And he called this concept functional hypocrisy. He said, how can we articulate one humane purpose? We want all students to learn, yet live in another reality where many of our students are not learning, where a lot of students are struggling. And Anthony, who I know some of you know, actually wrote a book about this called Overcoming the Achievement Gap Trap. And he and his colleague, Luis Cruz, another terrific speaker and presenter and thinker about this kind of work, wrote a book together just recently called Time for Change. But Anthony's point is a good one, is it not? This idea that how can we articulate one humane purpose and say we're for this? And when he mentioned that, it reminded me of when I was at Stevenson in my early days there. We said that 100% of our students will go to college, but the reality was only would go on post what we call high school to some type of post-secondary work. And yet the reality was only about 48% of our students were doing that. So we articulated a very humane purpose, but the reality revealed something quite different. And not only that, but as you can imagine, it was our more marginalized students, our students of color, who were not the ones that were advancing. Our students from special ed programs who were not the students advancing. And we had to decide, how do we take care of that? And the answer is, you can't do it by yourself. It's not one at a time. It definitely is and has to become a cultural decision. And I think there are three cultural things that we can do as educators, no matter what our role is, to help this happen. One is to create a culture of belonging, feelings of connection, so that every child, no matter who they are, feels connected to the school and to the work. You are either in or you are out. That's how a lot of kids feel. That's even how a lot of adults feel. I wasn't invited to be part of that task force. I'm not ever invited to be part of that. I'm always feeling like I'm left out. You're either included or you're excluded. Also, what about a culture of vulnerability? Vulnerability is so difficult. Vulnerability leaves us defensive. It has the power to wound. Vulnerability feels like it's a weakness. And yet there is a vulnerability trust connection that we're going to look at here in just a minute. And then what about a culture of validation, confirming the worthiness of others? That very simple question I just asked you 5 minutes ago. Who is a colleague who has helped you thrive at work in 2020? Is a validation of that colleague. But we rarely tell them. So do we have a culture of validation where we constantly confirm the worthiness of others? So let's take belongingness first. So there is this concept of what's called thwarted belongingness. It comes from Naomi Eisenberger at UCLA, which for us is in my state where I'm at right now in California. And she says that thwarted belongingness is very dangerous because accepting any form of not belonging is painful to people. And this is coming from the understanding of the neuroscience. So this is a brain issue, a brain processing issue. When we're excluded from a meeting, when we don't get invited to key events, when our ideas are ignored at the team meeting, the pain that we feel from being thwarted, from belonging to that group, is experienced in the same areas of the brain as physical pain. In fact, she says, ready? The pain of rejection or humiliation is just as real as a stubbed toe. The networks that process the pain in your brain are exactly the same. I'm kind of laughing at this because I actually broke my little toe. I have a compressed fracture of my little toe, which makes it very hard to run, by the way, with shoes on. But I'm still going to do that beachside dash anyway. And it's painful all the time. And I think thwarted belongingness hits that same pain center, but sort of in a different, and maybe even a more subtle way. The research, the neuroscience goes on to say we are primarily guided in our work life, in our personal life, in our professional life, by the drive to connect to others. And so even people who feel like they want isolation, they still want to be connected. They want to belong. And what we have to do is figure out a way to make that belonging efficient. So I'm going to give you a belonging test here. And actually, if you do download the handout that Lauren was so nice enough to give you the link right at the start, you will see on page 6 of that handout, we're not going to, you can do it off my screen here, what you're looking at, but I want you to know that I provided this for you. It shows up somewhere in Soul. And this would be something, again, that I would probably do this summer or do at the end of the year if you want, as people reflect back on their level of responsibility. What I like about this belonging test is the following. When you look at the test, notice the directions do say a forced ranking, which is hard, because when you say rank between 1 and 10, most people want to say a 7 or a 3 or a 6, but you've got to be a 1, 5, or 10. 1 meaning you're terrible at that. You never take responsibility for it. 10 meaning you are always responsible, like you're awesome at it. And 5 meaning you're still working on it. And notice the very carefully chosen word here for the type of action it is, a responsibility action. If you notice, these 5 areas of belonging all say, I will take responsibility, right? I will take responsibility. This is about you and I owning up to be responsible for creating a culture of belonging, not waiting for someone else to do it. And so what you do here, and I mentioned this in a handout on page 6. Whoops, I don't want to give you those directions yet. Hold on, let me get back there. So what I'd like you to do here is this. You can see that these 5 elements of belonging, and by the way, a lot of this comes out of a book called The Culture Code by Daniel Coyle. I'm going to give you the reference for that book in just a second. But but they apply to us in our profession. And this is coming from organizational theory, but it certainly applies to us. So take a look. So number 1, impact. I will take responsibility and understand the nature of my impact on the relationships I have with my colleagues and students. I will ask, notice the I will ask part. How can I listen better to others? 2, I'll take responsibility to honor the work-related agreements of my colleagues and students. Do any of you right now have problems with your team because you agree on things, but then people don't honor them? They don't, even though you agreed, they just go off and do, and so now who gets harmed? The students. But you will always ask, are we doing the right things? Because don't expect me to honor agreements that aren't going to help kids learn, that are for bad things, right? Awareness. I will take responsibility, be aware and understand the emotional lives of my students and colleagues. I'll actually notice that one of my colleagues is suffering right now. I'll be aware that they're going through a difficult time. I'll be aware of who they are. I will come to the meeting and not just be so involved in myself, I'm not aware of you. Engagement. I'll take responsibility to be fully engaged each day with my students and colleagues. I will ask, how do I get and stay charged? Not how will you make me stay charged? I will come to the meeting, to the community, and lift it up. And then balance. I love this one because the first 4 are nice, but they'll burn us out if we're not careful. So balance is I'll take responsibility to understand my own destiny and impact, and I won't blame anyone else for my lack of effort. Well, if I had a better principal, if I didn't have to work with you guys, if I just had better students, no, we're not going to act like a victim. How do I balance my uniqueness, what I contribute, with the core value agreements of my team and colleagues? I think we'd never want to lose our individuality within our contributions to the team. So here's my question for you today to use in the chat box. I'd like you to place the belonging factor. There's 5 of them here. And if you, in the chat box, what you do is just place the name and the number. So number 2, honor. Number 4, engagement. Number 5, balance. Of these 5 factors of belonging and taking personal responsibility for it, which one, despite everything coming at you this year, have you been great at? Yeah, which one? And we'll see if we have some in common with the folks that are on. So just take a second, and all you got to do is type in 5 balance, or 2 honor, or 1 impact. Okay? All right. I'll be quiet. Give you a chance to do that while I fix my little error here. I'll do it too. Huh. It's good. These are great, and thank you for sharing, for putting yourself out there. I will say that you notice how I'm asking you this question. I asked you which one's your strength. I think we practice deficit thinking too often. Well, because what would be typical? Which one do you have to work on for next year, for 2021? Better get on that this summer. And that might be fine to have a reflection this summer about, oh my gosh, how can I do a better job of either honoring, taking responsibility to honor the work of the team, or to talk to someone who needs to do a better job of that, or whatever. But I do think it's important to recognize our strengths and to feel good about that, and to feel like, oh my gosh, if we've got a team where my strength's awareness, but your strength is engagement, and someone else's strength is honor, that could end up being a good team because we bring different strengths to the team meeting. So, all right, belonging. One last thing I'll just mention. There's the book I was telling you about, Daniel Coyle's book. So you'll have that on the slide in the PDF. But I don't want to get into these in too much detail because they each take quite a bit of time. But Coyle provides some suggestions for ways in which we communicate, or ways we interact that can foster a belonging culture. So number 1, over communicate your listening. Every time someone says something, just make sure you go back and check and say, so did I understand this correctly? Is this what you want us to do? Never assume we know what the person meant. Always over communicate that you're listening. And that actually helps with that very first responsibility, right? Impact. Spotlight your own fallibility early on. In other words, be vulnerable. I'm not perfect in this. I'm going to make the same mistakes you're making. Actually, I've made those mistakes before. So let's go. Let's work on it. That vulnerability is very important, as you'll see in just 1 second. Embrace the messenger of the bad news. Sometimes you have to give a verbal hug to someone who just told you, well, it's not going to be like this next week. We thought we could open school like this. We're going to have to do this. And you just got to say, do you need a hug, a virtual hug, so to speak. And then preview future connection. This would be more normal times, I think, not so much the stress we've been under this year, but where we use role models. We help people see what the school can be like a year down the road or 2 years down the road. So we preview future connection. When we become a school like this, here's what it will look like, because here's a school doing it. And so we kind of we create that vision of the future. We paint it. And then overdo your thank yous. No matter what we do to thank people around us, Coyle's basic point, and I agree with him, is we can never say thank you enough. We can never provide, if we all just systemically figured out ways to create a culture of thank yous, believe it or not, it begins to make, why? Because if you thank me for something, I just had a national training webinar I had to do on Saturday. And it was all day. It was really intensive. It involved all the folks who do a certain amount of work for us here in the United States. And we only do it once every 2 years. So it's a really important moment for us. And there was something about the way after it was over, the people were responding to each other in a form of thank yous for the work of the day that just made me realize, like, oh, so that's what COIL means, because it created this sense of belonging. Like, wow, I really do belong here. Like, this is, we're all part of this. We're in it together. I do think that the best learning community cultures are just like really good families. They sort of have this sense of being of lots of people in the group on the team who are warm demanders. And what is a warm demander? Some of you will like this. A warm demander. A warm demander is a person who presents high challenge. This is what we're going to learn, and we can all learn it. This is what we're going to do as a team, and we'll get through it. But also high support. So we demand, we don't lower the bar and say, well, you know what, because of all these obstacles, all these circumstances, we're just not even going to try to do what we would normally do. We'll just lower the bar for all the kids this year. But you can't really do that, because that's going to be disingenuous for those kids, or we can't lower the bar for certain kids, let's say. So warm demanders keep the bar high and provide high support. And there's a great book that I know some of you might have noticed in the chat box when I asked the question about someone who's helped me thrive this year. I mentioned Tina. And Tina and I are working together to create a new center called the Professional Wellness Center for Teachers, for educators. And she has a book called Take Time for You. And I know she's done some work in Australia. So it's a great book. If you're looking for a small book to use this year, Tina's book is great. And I think she gives lots of practical suggestions, including how to become a warm demander. So let's take a look at vulnerability, the second cultural piece. So belonging, now vulnerability. And I have to tell you, I don't think in general we're running to what I call the vulnerability trough, right? So let's take a look at the word. Vulnerable is ultimately derived from the Latin noun vulnus, or wound. Vulnus led to the Latin verb vulnerare, meaning to wound. So basically, it's used figuratively to suggest a defenselessness against non-physical attacks, in other words, verbal attacks. Someone can be vulnerable to criticism or failure. It's usually followed by the preposition to, as in, I'm vulnerable to criticism. I'm vulnerable to not being good enough. I'm vulnerable to failing. I'm vulnerable to not measuring up. I'm vulnerable to falling short of my goals. I'm vulnerable to being hurt by you. I don't want to be a part of this team. It's too vulnerable. You guys are just going to hurt me. And so what do? I just prefer my isolation, thank you. This is one of the biggest reasons why people don't want to participate in a collaborative culture. Even though there are all those benefits we saw from the Harvard study and other things, because they have, all it takes one time is for somebody on the team to say, well, that's a stupid idea. What were you thinking? Boom. I knew I'd be vulnerable to, I knew I couldn't measure up. So we don't want to be, we don't like being vulnerable. We don't like that feeling of weakness. And yet it is in being vulnerable. In fact, in Soul, I tell some gut-wrenching stories. And some of my reviewers were like, Tim, I can't believe how vulnerable you're being. And I'm like, well, I can't ask my readers to become vulnerable if I'm not myself. So let's just take a look. Here's my question. You can type it in the chat box. It's an easy one. Which comes first? Vulnerability or trust? Does the team have to develop trust and then we're more likely to be vulnerable? Or do we have to develop vulnerability and that will lead to trust? All right, take a guess. It's just a guess. I'll take a drink of water. And I can't type in an answer because I know the answer. Interesting. We've got a few trusts. We're leaning towards vulnerability a little bit. Okay. All right. And so you got your answer, whether you put it in there or not. It's one or the other. Well, are you ready? It turns out that actually vulnerability comes first. And that in the best best cultures that are thriving in their community with one another, the leaders of that school, as well as the teachers and other educators themselves, have actually said, we're going to be intentional about creating a culture of vulnerability in our school, because we know that allows us to create greater trust. And this isn't Tim Kanold's opinion. There's a lot of neuroscience evidence on this, which I cite in Soul. The neuroscience of trust affirms vulnerability is a precursor to trust. People are always asking me, Tim, how do you build trust? How do you build trust? And I'm like, become more vulnerable. Vulnerability creates and strengthens a trust culture throughout your school system. Now, what does it mean to become more vulnerable? Here it is. It's really this simple. Ready? I am. I'm getting there. There we go. So one of the things that you can do to create greater trust through vulnerability is to create vulnerability loops throughout your school culture, through the way you interact with one another. And, I can't evaluate this for you. I think only you can kind of look, and I'm so glad we're doing this at the end of your school year, because I feel like it provides for an opportunity, especially if you're in a school leadership position, to think about this summer. Or if you're I'm part of a team, a teacher team, to think about it in terms of how are you going to evaluate this with your team. But a vulnerability loop basically looks like this. You and I are having a discussion. We're working together as part of a team. I send out a signal of vulnerability to you. I'm not sure how to use this e-learning tool. Can you help me? Would be an example from this year, especially. Or it could even be something I just did recently with Tina Bogren, who I'm working with right now. I sent her an email and I said, so here's what I'm thinking about this idea. Could you respond and let me know what you think? That's pretty vulnerable. I'm kind of putting myself out there, right? Number two, the second step of the vulnerability loop is you detect my signal of vulnerability. You actually have to detect it. Like I'm kind of asking for help. I don't have all the answers. I need some help. You detect my signal of vulnerability. Jim needs help from me, right? And this is really important if you have positional authority over other people, because sometimes they think, like when I became a principal, I think I shocked people sometimes when I would say to them, I need your help with this. But even though they like, well, but you're the boss, you're supposed to know everything. Well, I don't know everything. Vulnerability is less about the sender, me. In a vulnerability culture, it's less about the sender. Hey, can you help me with this e-learning tool? That is important. I have to start the loop, but it's more about the receiver. The second person and how they respond is the key. And we have to be aware of that in our school culture. What happens? You respond to me by saying, I've had this same problem in the past. Let me help you. You don't respond to me by saying, like, how can you not know this? I've already showed it to you twice. I detect your signal. Wow, this hasn't just been hard for me. There's other people this is hard for too. And then a norm's established. Closeness and trust increase according to the brain research on this. We both have some areas of weakness and imperfection. Our profession has low tolerance for imperfection. It has low tolerance for weakness. You've been teaching 10 years. How can you not know this? How can you not know the best way to bring this concept to the kids? Because I don't know everything. And the things I've been trying aren't working. That's why I'm asking you for help. And in a thriving professional learning community, that vulnerability is open. We're going to look at the results of our student learning on that last common assessment we gave. And we're not going to judge one another. We're not going to shame one another, but we're going to see some of us didn't do as well as others of us on a certain standard. We're going to ask for help. So it begins to create that type of idea that learning has no boundaries. No matter how good I am at something, I could be better. And so I'm going to ask you, how can I make this better? What do you think? We are confident enough, and this is really key. I think when you go back to look at this, or you go to talk about it with colleagues, in successful school cultures where vulnerability works, I think the adults are confident enough in themselves. Like, I'm confident that I can do the work I'm being asked to do, but I also realize there's still a lot I don't know. And so I'm able to be vulnerable and ask you, hey, and by the way, a great way to signal step one, a vulnerability signal, is to start it with the words, I wonder. I wonder. I wonder. Okay? I wonder. Or however you would say that in your vernacular. I wonder what would happen if we tried this. I'm wondering why these students are struggling. And so when you say I wonder, you're posing it in such a way as to invite discussion, as to invite the fact that this is an area of weakness, but without it being shameful. So we call them our wonderings. Exchanges of vulnerability are the pathway on which a trusting collaboration is built. So there you go. There it is. Okay, good luck with that one. So please steal this, use this slide this summer, whatever's best. The last thing I want to talk about, and then I think with maybe in the last 5 minutes, Lauren and I can answer any questions you might have. I want to talk about a culture of validation. So validation is it says what sculpture is to a block of marble, education is to the human soul. So as educators, our job is to validate progress that students are making, progress our colleagues are making. And all it really is this. Now, I think this slide and this sentence is very powerful. Validation is simply the process of recognizing. Okay, so I'm aware. That's that awareness one that I saw a lot of you put in the chat box earlier. Establishing, so creating structures if they're not there, and confirming the worthiness or legitimacy of our students and colleagues as persons. You might not speak like me. You might not be the same color as me. You might not have the same religion as me. You may be of a different gender than me, but you are still validated as a person in my class, as a person on my team. We are in this thing called humanity together, right? That's validation. And so validation has a kind of a feedback loop that looks like this. See, validation, notice what it says. It's the process of recognizing. That means I've got to be aware of what your work is, of what you're doing, how you're doing, with the curriculum work, if you're my student, our work as professionals, if you're my colleague, enough that I can then confirm or give you feedback to confirm or the effort that you've made, right? So that you can see then how validation is about feedback. I'm giving you these comments because I have very high expectations for you and our team, and I know you can reach them. So here's the reflection for the summer. do I indicate that, one, you are part of this team, you are part of this group? I'm not just looking at you as an individual, but I'm looking at you as you are part of our team, and our team matters. Our team is special. And we have high standards in this school. We have high standards on this third grade team. We have high standards in this English class. We have high standards here. And I believe that you can reach those standards. Validation, because think about it, what is teacher efficacy? Teacher efficacy is a teacher's belief in their capability to do the work they're being asked to do. Self-efficacy, teacher self-efficacy, is their belief in their capability to do the work they're being asked to do. And so we must say all the time, I believe you can reach those standards. I believe you can do this. But Tim, I've never used that technology before. It's okay. This group has high standards. We need to use the technology in order to meet those standards. I believe you can do that, and I will help you do it. I will be a warm demander. We're not going to give in on how we assess our students with meaningful feedback just because we're remote learning. Right. So you get that idea. This is all validation is. But I want to point out something here before I kind of get us to our Q&A. There is a difference between tolerance and validation. And I think what I often notice is in a lot of school cultures, they speak tolerance, but they fail at validation. So let me explain what I mean. If tolerance is sympathy or indulgence for beliefs or practices differing from or conflicting with our own, somebody on our team has beliefs or practices different from our own, so I tolerate it, right? Student doesn't quite look like me and they act a little differently, but I'll tolerate it. But validation is an action, not just a sympathy or indulgence. Beyond mere awareness of those differences, we act to better understand. We act to integrate their thoughts into the team's ideas. We act to become more collaborative and in community with that person because they're on our team or they're one of our students. And so therefore we validate their humanity. We don't shut them off because they don't believe just like us. So I like that concept because to me, often I will see elements of tolerance, but not necessarily, which means, hey, Tim, we're really socially aware. We're very tolerant of other people's beliefs, but we don't really validate those beliefs and figure out a way to integrate them into the public school or private school nature of our work. And the last thing on this is that I think from my perspective in terms of our soul story, because I want to be careful here to tell you, you don't want to be tolerant or validate beliefs that are causing harm to others. It's why the soul story part is important. Soul story sculptors are about their willingness to see the positive potential in others, even if they don't see that same in themselves, those others don't, but always for the moral good, always for the good, the greater good, right? So keep that in mind. It's not to do that in a way that's being tolerant of behaviors that are harming others. So validation just takes tolerance to an action level where I act on validating who you are. I act on just beyond my own understanding to more of an integration. And so here's my question for you. Give you a second to read it. So I'll just give you a quick example, and then I'll get close to wrapping it up here. So now I'm saying to you, think about one action you can take this summer to become a more trusted voice and gently become a sculptor that inspires belief, confidence, desire, and someone who has beliefs, practice, or looks different than you. So while I'm writing Soul, and I can't get into specifics because you may or may not notice this when you go to read the book. But when I was writing the book, I became very aware that I did not understand a certain position, belief, action of a particular group of people, and that I wasn't necessarily representing that very well in the book. And so I called someone who I knew well enough to call them at least, and said, can I sit down with you and interview you and ask you lots of questions, because you don't look like me, you don't think like me, you look very different than me. I know we don't have the same beliefs, but I need to better understand why this is who you are and why these are your beliefs. And that led to quite a bit of insight and inspiration and common ground between the two of us. But that was very intentional. So one of the things is becoming intentional about a student or a colleague who you might not quite agree with, but you're going to figure out a way to this summer to come up with a plan to listen better and to interact with them. Anyway, that would be the deeper thought, right? The shallow thought would be, hey, just deal with it. All right, so this is it. So my hope is that no matter how bad it got this year, you have been able to embrace the busy and full life. It is okay to be busy. I want to say that to you. I have a full schedule. I have a lot of activities. I'm balancing many plates, we say. I'm including my team time, my family time. And I actually find some time for quiet, reflective time daily, what we talked about last time. My job is physically and emotionally demanding. I cannot do the job without the help of others. Thus, I'm part of a community. That's a good life. What's not good is to have a hurried life, a life where we fail to have time to notice others, a life where we just feel constantly frazzled and in a state of anxiety. But I think if we can get to this place that you see here, where I can do the job, I cannot do my job I recognize I need my colleagues, then we are beginning to thrive in our community. Now, what I wanted to share with you is it's been fun. Thank you for doing this with me, staying on the call. I'm going to mention this, and then I think we've got, actually, Lauren, look at that. We only have a couple of minutes left. But Lauren and I wanted to share this with you and tell you. So Soul will actually be coming out in February of 2021 in the United States, but March of 2021 in Australia. And so as a way to say thank you for those of you that came on the call, this week the Hawker Brownlow office is going to select 5 different participants from our sessions, and we're going to send you 3 copies of Soul on me, free. I'm going to pay for it. It's because you took the time. That's the least I could do to give you a celebration gift back, and we'll announce those by this Friday. And we're going to share that so that you can have a couple of books. I'm going to give you 3 so that maybe you can have a little book study with the book as you see fit. So with that, Lauren, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for that wonderful session, Tim. We do only have very, very little time, but I think we've got a couple of really important questions. So if you wouldn't mind hanging about just a little bit longer, that would be really appreciated. So we do have a question about vulnerability again. Yeah. How do you approach or move towards vulnerability if you are the person who is different from the majority of the group?
Yeah, I think it is true that you have to, it starts with one person at a time. So you have to have a conversation with someone on that group or in that team that in which you take that risk. I do think that first person, it is a risk-taking step. But I wouldn't do it with just anyone. I would probably do it with someone who I feel, based on how I've listened to them and heard them speak before, there is some safety. So that I would definitely encourage that. But it's not the whole group at a time, it's one person at a time.
So it's really like small steps, moving with people that you have some level of trust with already, and then moving that outwards to the group. Is that right?
That's correct. Yep.
Great. Thank you for that question. And just briefly as well, do you have any time to just share with us very, very briefly why you really were driven to write Soul, why you chose to write it? What's the background?
Well, when I wrote Heart, it was very experimental. It was a book that was a journal book, a group study book, and Solution Tree had never done anything like that before. And we had such a crazy success with it that Solution Tree was putting a little bit of pressure on me to say, like, hey, Tim, have you thought about a follow-up book? And so initially I thought about Heart 2 or something like that. But when I was 7 years old, I was, as you'll find out when you read the book, I had a time in my life where I was homeless, and at age 7 ended up on the doorstep of my aunt and my uncle. And my uncle taught me how to play the song Heart and Soul on the piano. And that idea of heart and soul always stuck with me. And then as I started talking to people, they were like, yeah, your heart is this, but your soul is this. And soul has a very spiritual meaning, but it wasn't my intent. I really wanted soul to be about this deeper connection for our work, the things I talked about today. And I just started, it took me 2 years. I was glad to see so much neuroscience evidence that this has meaningful impact on our work. And I will tell you that Heart was hard to write, but Soul was actually a joy to write. And I think it's really hard. For some people, they're going to want to do it as an individual reflection study, because you are going to be vulnerable if you speak about the things I ask you to write about with others, because we're going to get into anger. There's a whole chapter on healthy and unhealthy responses to anger, and how can we actually, in every step of the way, I try to give you some meaningful research and advice on how to just grow in so many of these things that are difficult for us, these obstacles that get in the way. So that's why we're starting the Professional Wellness Center, and Soul will be one of the anchor books of the center. So there's more to it, but that would be my brief answer, because we are definitely getting past everybody's time.
Thank you so much, Tim. You've really helped us out a lot. We'll have to wrap it up there, though, unfortunately. Thank you, everyone, so much for all your time this morning. Thank you to all the educators out there for everything you do. We really appreciate it. Don't forget that a recorded version of this will be available in 7 to 14 days, and we'll have the winners out at the end of the week.
Yes,
so fingers crossed you get your couple of free copies, and then we can all chat. Thank you so much, Tim, for your time and expertise. And with that, everyone, thank you very much and enjoy your day.
Thank you, Lauren. Thanks so much. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.